The US slaps sanctions on Venezuela after a controversial vote to change the constitution. Will the fallout further isolate the nation and its government? I'm Shuli Ghosh, and today's newsmaker is President Nicolás Maduro. In the 48 hours since Venezuela held a vote to rewrite its constitution, at least 10 people are dead. The US has placed sanctions on the country, and 2 of its main opposition leaders have been arrested, their whereabouts unknown. But President Nicolás Maduro remains doggedly defiant. He insists 8 million people voted on Sunday, the biggest turnout in 18 years. But the opposition says it was more like 2 million. US President Donald Trump described him as a dictator. Maduro's response? He doesn't take orders from the empire. As the 2 leaders publicly squabble, ordinary Venezuelans continue to suffer, as Sandra Gatman explains.
It was a day hailed by the government as the start of peace in Venezuela. A vote to elect a new constituent assembly that will rewrite the country's constitution after months of unrest. This was the deadliest day of clashes since protests against President Nicolás Maduro began 4 months ago. The opposition called for Venezuelans to take to the streets and say 12 people were killed. They see the vote as an illegal move to dissolve the National Assembly controlled by anti-Maduro parties. But the vote went ahead and Maduro claimed victory.
Es la votación más grande que haya sacado la revolución bolivariana en toda la historia electoral de 18 años.
According to Venezuelan law, a constituent assembly can be elected to rewrite the constitution. Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, held a similar vote in 1999, which led to changes like allowing presidential re-election and a new name for the country. But Chavez called a referendum first, asking Venezuelans if they supported the reforms, a step Maduro has skipped. What makes this vote even more controversial is that the opposition boycotted it, meaning all 5,500 candidates were pro-government. Maduro's critics also say the more than 8 million votes claimed by Venezuela's election authority were in fact closer to 2.5 million.
No reconocemos ese proceso fraudulento. Para nosotros es nulo, no existe.
Opposition leaders say Maduro's grip on power is now sealed and fear targeted persecution. On Monday night, 2 politicians under house arrest were reportedly taken from their homes by Venezuelan intelligence. A chorus of international critics have condemned the vote, including some of Venezuela's former regional allies.
None of these suggested constitutional changes from this constituent assembly will be neither accepted nor recognized.
Maduro is not just a bad leader, he is now a dictator.
The U.S. went further, slapping new sanctions against President Nicolás Maduro. But the question everyone is asking is whether the Trump administration is prepared to hit Venezuela where it hurts most by stopping the import of its oil. America is Venezuela's biggest crude oil buyer, and it's the country's only source of revenue left as the economy plunges into chaos. But will further moves against the Venezuelan government make life worse for ordinary people and radicalize Maduro's politics?
Mr. Imperator Donald Trump.
Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Anna Quintana. She's a Latin America and Western Hemisphere policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And from London is Javier Faje, journalist and Latin America analyst. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. And many world leaders are saying that this vote in Venezuela marks the end of democracy. But President Maduro says it was a vote, people voted freely, and he won.
The vote was a completely undemocratic, and highly fraudulent process. It was 545 candidates who were hand-selected by Maduro, by the ruling Socialist Party, to take control. And they will now rewrite the Constitution, get rid of the National Assembly, the democratically elected National Assembly. And this is going to be the same type of consolidation of power that we saw occur in Cuba after the Communist Revolution.
And one immediate thing that's happened, which has caused a lot of worry, is that two opposition leaders have been arrested. Their families say their whereabouts are unknown. Do you think that that could be a sign of things to come?
I think things are undoubtedly going to get worse. The fact that Antonio Ledesma and Leopoldo Lopez were taken from their homes at around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, with no warning, with nothing. They were arbitrarily arrested. I mean, it's a sign of things to come, and it's definitely a sign that the Venezuelan government is exceptionally desperate, and whatever legitimacy they knew that they thought that they had, they've lost it. And I definitely think the repression against the opposition is only going to get worse.
Javier, let me come to you, because you were shaking your head when Anna was saying that this was an undemocratic process. But let me put this to you. There were no independent observers monitoring that vote, and there was no option for people to vote against it. So how is it a fair representation of what the Venezuelan people wanted?
These votes have been audited, and anyone can go to the Electoral Commission and check and verify that these votes were actually legitimate. Anyone can do that. Your correspondent in Caracas can do that. And I don't know what on what planet she's living, because this is absolute and utter nonsense. According to Article 348 of the Constitution, the President had the right to call a Constituent Assembly. Furthermore, the National Assembly, controlled by the opposition, could have done that, and they decided not to do it because they couldn't agree among themselves. They had the right to call a Constituent Assembly. I will go even further than that. But since 2013, leaders of the opposition like Freddy Guevara, Maria Corina Machado, have been asking for a Constituent Assembly. Why didn't they call one themselves? This
well,
is
the opposition...
that I love. Hold on a second.
Javier, the opposition are saying that only the turnout was just 15%. So less than 2 million people voted for this.
And so what evidence do they have that that's the case? You see, these votes have been audited. Anyone can go to the Electoral Commission and ask for the verification of these votes. If you don't want to do it, if nobody wants to do it, that is not the problem of the Venezuelan government. They don't want to believe. Furthermore, they said that 7 million people voted in this so-called plebiscite that they called a few weeks ago. Again, there was no way to verify. Do we have to believe that these 7 million voted, but only 12 million people voted in a verifiable election? This is an absolute nonsense. The President was entitled to call to this Constituent Assembly. And furthermore, there's 9 objectives which are going to be discussed in the Constituent Assembly. None of them talks about extending the power of the president or extending his term in office. None of them. They deal with post-oil economy, to the institutionalization of the misiones, fighting climate change, elements related to the judiciary. None of them talks about, they're not going to discuss the extending the powers of President Maduro.
Anna, let me put that to Anna.
So please.
Javier is saying that this Constituent Assembly doesn't extend the powers of President Maduro. Obviously, that is the big criticism that has been levelled at him.
It's not just a criticism. It's what Javier is spewing is Venezuelan government propaganda. So the Constituent Assembly was a completely undemocratic process. The opposition at no point had a time to go and through and hold their own Constituent Assembly, because the National Electoral Council is controlled by the Venezuelan government. It's controlled completely by Maduro. They are hand-picked appointees by the Venezuelan government. On July 16th, the opposition held their own vote. Civil society groups all throughout Venezuela and throughout the rest of the world, the Venezuelan expatriates, voted. And you know what? 7.6 million Venezuelans strongly voted condemning Maduro. This is 7.6 million Venezuelans, much more than the 2.5 who voted during the Constituent Assembly vote.
Okay,
so facts are facts, and the numbers are incredibly clear, and they can be reinforced by numerous civil society groups.
That's absolutely nonsense.
Why is that nonsense, Javier?
I think that because
why do you discredit the results of one vote and not the other?
You ask me a question, let me answer it. You can verify how many people voted during the vote for the Constituent Assembly. You cannot verify that 7 million people voted because there was no way to do that. That's the difference. Second, assuming that 7 million people voted in that plebiscite. Let's assume that, although we know that many people voted more than once. But let's give the opposition these 7 million votes. It's slightly more than 35% of the electorate. Furthermore, it's slightly more than the people that voted for the candidate of the opposition in the elections in 2013.
President Maduro's supporters are saying even at the higher end of the turnout estimate, which is something like 41%, that's still not much of a mandate, is it? If there really was just 41% turnout.
Well, if you knew how elections happen in Venezuela from 1999 onwards, the levels of abstention have always been very high in Venezuela, always been very high. Furthermore, President Maduro won the election in 2013 with 7 million votes. So no, I'm sorry, but
let's move away from the mechanics of the election and talk about what the consequences have been. The US has imposed sanctions on Venezuelans, targeting 13 high-ranking officials, and immediately after that vote, it froze US assets held by President Maduro. Anna, does this go far enough?
I think they need to go further. If things continue the way that they're going, if Venezuela continues to show a disregard for the democratic norms that every single country in Latin America has agreed to, that every single country in Latin America since the year 2001 has abided by, then yes, the U.S. government does need to penalize them. And it's not just the U.S. government alone. Just last week, the 13 Venezuelan government officials that were sanctioned, there were also reciprocal sanctions by Colombia, by Panama, and by Paraguay, if I'm not mistaken. That's a strong statement. And also, I mean, Javier, I'm very sorry, and you and I can go back and forth on the numbers of who voted and what can be verified and what can't. But you know what can be verified? That on Sunday alone, in 24 hours, 16, let me finish. Okay, that's fine. And I know I started with the numbers, and I'll continue with the numbers. Okay, that's great. But the most important number that should be remembered is in 24 hours, 16 innocent, let me finish, please, because I let you speak, and now you're going to let me speak. 16 innocent Venezuelans were killed by the Venezuelan government in 24 hours alone. In the 4 months that the protests have been going on, 121 protesters have been killed. They have been killed by active live fire. The Venezuelan government is shooting kids dead in the street. The Venezuelan government has armed tanks going after protesters. And that's a number that cannot be disputed and cannot be lied by, and that cannot be lied. And I would love to see how you can justify that.
Just picking up on that point, Javier, but it is the case. It is the case that opposition leaders, two prominent opposition leaders, have been arrested, and President Maduro has promised that more opposition leaders will be prosecuted. So clearly, from now on, we're going to see a bigger crackdown on protesters.
Hang a second. Let's go back to the dead people who died. Are you including, Anna, those Chavistas who were set on fire by opposition gangs? No, you are not, are you? Because you claim that all the people were killed by the army or by the police. You have not included the candidates that were killed during the election for the Constituent Assembly, pro-Chavez candidates. Of course, you are not including that. You are saying the 100 people were killed by the army. You know that is not true. You are actually manipulating deliberately. You are being extremely dishonest by putting all the dead people in the hands of the government. You know that is not the case. There's many videos that I invite your viewers to go and check how these Chavistas were set on fire by gangs from the opposition and died of the injuries. So please, let's stop talking about all the people were killed by them. Going back to the session, they were rearrested. I don't really know, to be honest with you, I don't know more details than anybody does about the arrest of Ledesma and Lopez. They were rearrested. They were arrested. They were on house arrest, and they were rearrested by the intelligence services. We haven't heard the reasons why. But I would like to remind you that Leopoldo Lopez from prison sent videos asking the army to intervene. That is absolutely wrong, because that exacerbates a situation of violence in Venezuela.
Can we agree there are clearly massive divisions within Venezuela over this? Even some government loyalists, former staunch supporters of President Maduro, are now saying that this is wrong. His Attorney General saying that Venezuela is now dictatorial. Let's have a listen to what Luisa Ortega Diaz said immediately after the vote.
And I address the country by categorical imperative and by the mandate of the Constitution and the law to disregard. Listen closely. To disregard the origin, process, and result of the immoral Presidential Constituent Assembly.
Javier, she's asking the country to disregard what she calls an immoral Constituent Assembly.
This is the same Attorney General who out of the 2,500 people who have been indicted for acts of violence, only 200 have been prosecuted. She has not done her job. This is the same one that justified the arrest of Leopoldo Lopez, who's being rearrested now. But at the same time, she doesn't seem to realize that the Constitution, seems to forget that the Constitution of Venezuela allows not only the President but the National Assembly to call for a Constituent Assembly. This is in the actual Constitution. It was not a decree that came out of the blue. This is so she's actually not that. She hasn't done her job. Not long ago, she gave an interview in radio saying that she would not prosecute people who have committed violence because that wouldn't serve any purpose. Basically saying she's given impunity to violent gangs to go and cause mayhem in Venezuela. So I'm sorry, but I don't recognize any moral authority in this woman.
Okay. Anna, going back to the issue of sanctions, we were talking about what the US has done, and you were saying they don't go far enough. One option that Mr. Trump, President Trump could be thinking about is imposing sanctions on the oil industry. Now, that is pretty much a nuclear option because that would further damage an economy that's already in freefall.
So I think an all-right oil embargo, I mean, that is definitely on the table. But prior to that, there are so many other steps that can and should be taken, and I'm quite glad that they are under consideration. Whether it's limiting the amount of oil that the United States processes from Venezuela. Javier, I'm speaking, and I never interrupted you, so please allow me to speak. The United States currently processes about 30% of Venezuela's crude oil production. That's 70,000 barrels, 70,000 barrels per day. That's something that could potentially be scaled back unless the Venezuelan government decides to respect the will of the Venezuelan people. And speaking on sanctions and the efficacy of sanctions and just how well-intentioned they are. So just early in the Trump administration, the president sanctioned the vice president of Venezuela, Tariq al-Assami, and froze his assets in the United States pursuant to the U.S. Drug Kingpin Act, because it is very well known that the vice president of Venezuela is a significant drug trafficker. To date, close to over $500 million in illicit finances and assets were located inside of the U.S. jurisdiction. That is significant. That $500 million can go an extremely long way in the future of Venezuela when there is a democratic transition and to rebuild the country. He is only one person. Imagine the rest of the money.
In terms of regional support as well, a few countries have supported President Maduro. Other countries have not. Colombia, Argentina, Mexico. Could Venezuela find itself isolated in the region?
I think Venezuela is finding themselves incredibly isolated. So it's been Argentina, Brazil, Colombia. I think they're speaking to me. It's been Argentina, Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Mexico, the UK, the European Parliament, and Spain as well. So this is not just a regional issue. It's recognized that this is an international issue.
Let me put that to Javier.
Mercosur is now considering getting rid of Venezuela.
How much of a problem is it that Venezuela might now or is finding itself isolated because of its plans to rewrite the Constitution? How much does this worry President Maduro?
But first of all, let me clarify. The southern Gulf of Mexico refineries depend heavily on heavy crude from Venezuela. The U.S. cannot afford to impose an embargo on Venezuela's exports of oil. You can go to Texas, to the Ocean, Texas, the refinery, they will tell you that they cannot afford not to have Venezuelan oil. That's why President Trump has not gone that far. Let's just start there. Second, in relation to isolation, they still have this. Colombia is the biggest ally of the U.S. in South America. Argentina has been extremely hostile to Venezuela from the moment President Macri took office. The president of Brazil is under investigation for alleged cases of corruption. I doubted that he has any moral authority to disavow, the government in Venezuela. Again, there are other countries that still support the Venezuelan government. Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua. Yes, I know you're going to say, yes, they are left-wing governments, but there's not everybody in the region who are against Venezuela. So yes, some
radical left-wing governments are
supporting the
guys,
boycott.
We're running out of time, so I just want to ask one more question of both of you. Aside from sanctions and isolation, what about dialogue? Can we encourage dialogue? Would that be a way out of this? Very quick answer from each of you. Anna?
I definitely agree that there should be a dialogue. I think a dialogue is the proper way to mediate out of this situation, but I think there should be very strict conditions on this dialogue. There should be the unconditional release of political prisoners, the unconditional guarantee that there will be no violence against political prisoners. I think there also needs to be the unconditional guarantee that illicit assets that were stolen from the Venezuelan people by the Venezuelan government have got to be returned.
Okay,
These are just a number of the conditions that have got to be in place for there to be a successful dialogue.
How do we bring stability back to Venezuela? Very quickly.
Well, I think the dialogue, I agree with Anna in that respect, that there should be a dialogue, but only a few hours ago, the wife of Antonio Ledesma, Missy Caprilli, said that she didn't like the dialogue, and there was a video broadcast by Mr. Ledesma saying that the dialogue had failed and he doesn't want any kind of dialogue. Okay. I'm afraid that some people in the opposition do not want a dialogue, but dialogue is the only solution for the problem. I agree with Anna in that respect.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Ana Quintana and Javier Faje. Thank you. Coming up, after a series of scandals, a sluggish economy and his lowest popularity rating since 2012, can Japan's Shinzo Abe hold on to power? And lobbying for favour. The diplomatic spat between Qatar and Saudi Arabia moves from the Middle East to American television. Just like the non-stick frying pan, Shinzo Abe's political career was once described as Teflon. But now, some of the dirt being thrown at the Japanese Prime Minister seems to be sticking. In the past few months, he's been accused of using his political power to help a friend and donating money to a school where his wife was listed as an honorary principal. According to one poll, his approval rating has dropped to 26%, a figure analysts call the death zone. Part of the reason is that his plan to revive the country's economy simply hasn't worked. Natalie Pohonen has more on what's dragging Shinzo Abe down.
The tide of political popularity can turn very quickly, and in Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is trying to change the current. His approval rating was sitting at about 60% just 3 months ago. It's now closer to 33%, the lowest level since he reclaimed the role of PM in 2012. Critics have accused him of favouritism. He's had to publicly address accusations he helped an old friend in a business deal involving a veterinary practice. His protege in the Liberal Democratic Party, Defence Minister Tomomi Inada, was forced to resign last week. Inada was seen as an important backer of Abe's nationalistic views, including his push to revise the pacifist constitution by 2020. She had urged people to vote for the party in the recent Tokyo City elections as a request from the self-defense forces. They are meant to be politically neutral.
閣僚が辞任することになったことについて、国民の皆様に心からお詫び申し上げたいと思います。
The party suffered a massive defeat in the Tokyo elections, its worst ever result in a Tokyo poll. It was a local election, but it was a signal to the Prime Minister that politics as usual is not popular. Shinzo Abe has become synonymous with the economic platform bearing his name, Abenomics, which has been driving the world's third largest economy since 2013, in a bid to reinvigorate the economy and leave behind decades of on-off deflation. He introduced the three-arrow model: monetary easing, fiscal stimulus and structural reforms. Because, as one Japanese proverb says, 3 sticks together are harder to break than one. Their ultimate goal is to boost domestic demand and raise inflation to 2%. The Bank of Japan had aimed to reach that figure in 2015. It's now projecting it'll happen in 2020. The International Monetary Fund's latest forecast is that Japan's economy will grow by 1.3% this year. Abenomics has helped to boost corporate profits, but the trickle-down benefits to individuals haven't been so clear-cut. And now that Abe himself is under political pressure, will he attempt to change the nation's economic course to ensure his own future? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Tokyo is Takuji Okubo. He's the chief economist of the Japan Risk Forum, an association of chief risk officers of major financial institutions and non-financial businesses in Japan. And in Norwich in the UK, Ra Mason, he's the Sasakwa lecturer in international relations and Japanese foreign policy at the University of East Anglia. Gentlemen, good to have both of you here with us. Takuji, let me start with you, because critics are saying that Abenomics have failed. 4 years on, inflation still hasn't risen. What's your response to that?
Well, there are many aspects of economy, but if you look at unemployment rate is one of the lowest in the last 20 years at 2.8%. I should say it's the lowest among developed economies. And then corporate profits has doubled in the last 5 years. So, you know, of course, you cannot have everything, but then I think Abenomics has made progress in a certain area.
So why then is the global perspective that Abenomics hasn't succeeded?
Right. Well, there has been virtually no structural reform. I think despite the popularity until recently, Prime Minister Abe did fail to deliver his promise on structural reform. So there has been a failure on the structural reform. And then, of course, as you mentioned earlier, there has been very little inflation. But then I think it was just too ambitious for Bank of Japan and the government to try to achieve 2% inflation in just a few years. It takes time, and it will come.
Well, you hit the nail on the head there when you mentioned Abe's popularity. Has Abenomics been one of the nails in his coffin?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I think Prime Minister Abe has relatively little to show when it comes to economic reform. So there is a perception both within Japan and outside Japan, he has failed in delivering that. And then on top of that, there has been numerous scandals. So I do believe that the Prime Minister's Abe's policy of expansive fiscal and monetary policy is the right way for Japan. So the risk that the Prime Minister Abe may have to step down, this may derail Japan's progress.
Yeah, well, let me bring Ra in here because, you know, gosh, how much has changed since 2012 when Japan couldn't get enough of Shinzo Abe. He was extremely popular and his whole Abenomics policy was a big hit. How much has changed since then?
Well, quite a lot has changed, evidently, particularly in terms of the security-related reforms. So it should be borne in mind here that although Abenomics may, as was pointed out, have several factors which have been quite successful, if you look under the surface, it's actually the case that Abe's security-based reforms have not been endorsed by the public, and this is largely a kind of personal or close close circle set of policies which he's trying to push in tandem with that agenda of Abenomics.
This is his pet policy of trying to rewrite the constitution to give Japan its own defence force again.
Absolutely, and this is a policy which has not, as I say, not been backed by the public. It's also received widespread opposition, and slowly the kind of directive to try and drive through and force through some of those policies towards constitutional revision have actually ended up leaking in towards those scandals. So one of the most recent scandals involving the storage of JSDF, Self-Defense Force logs in South Sudan, it could be argued is certainly something which might have been damaging to Prime Minister Abe in terms of not accurately reflecting the risks which the JSDF faces in zones such as South Sudan. So it's not the case that he can any longer kind of completely disconnect these scandals from his own personal political agenda, which is not always entirely popular.
Yeah, so this scandal involving his defence minister is just one of several scandals. Takuji, you're in Tokyo. I mean, how much of this has really flattened Shinzo Abe? He's got the defence minister scandal over that peacekeeping issues in South Sudan, but also these school approval scandals where he's accused of showing favouritism to his friends. What is the mood there about all of this?
Right. Well, I think if you look at the past popularity of prime ministers, I think Japanese voters tend to care more about the sincerity of the prime minister, or more so I think economic success seems to count less. So although Prime Minister Abe has delivered on economic front, as I mentioned, low unemployment rate, high profits, slightly, small rising wages. So he did deliver, but then the scandal is really hurting, and I don't think he has he's ready to get take back the control. So at this rate, I do think his popularity will continue to decline, and I don't think he will survive to end of 2018 as a prime minister. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point, Ra. His approval rating has dropped to 26%, which some, well, according to one poll, which some analysts are saying is the death zone, and several previous MPs who've gone that low have left. Where do you think he is with that, Ra? Do you think he's going to actually have to step down in 2018?
Well, I think that's less clear in the sense that there's various things in play here. But
sorry, Takuji, let Ra answer this and I'll come back to you.
Sorry if I may. So I think one of the interesting factors there is the way in which this is being reported. Only one of the major polls has actually listed his approval rating as low as that. And if, for example, you take a poll of polls, it seems that actually his overall approval rating is closer to something like in the low 30s%, so 32 or 33%. And there are various areas where he would be able to readjust against some of those scandals in order to possibly bolster his approval ratings in the short term.
He's going to have to bolster him a lot, even if it's 32, 33%. That's still pretty low.
Well, not necessarily, because Abe doesn't have a powerful opponent, certainly not in the opposition. So probably his most powerful opponents come from within his own party in the LDP. Figures like the current Foreign and Defence, or now Defence Secretary, due to Inada's resignation after her scandal. So Mr. Kishida Fumio, and also Mr. Ishiba Shigeru, who is no longer in the cabinet but is a powerful figure within the LDP. So those two figures, for example, both have shown fairly openly a degree of criticism towards Abe, despite being very strong LDP or very strong characters within the LDP party itself. So there is a potential for him to perhaps lose his power base within the LDP. But low approval ratings are being pitched against the complete kind of disarray, which is the opposition in Japan, which means that even a low approval rating does not necessarily spell political demise.
Takuji, what do you think of that? And is there an alternative or a credible rival to Mr. Abe?
Right. Well, I do believe that a credible rival will appear. So when a sitting prime minister is popular, of course it's very dangerous to oppose him. So nobody will step up. But now that the popularity is low, there will be rivals. I don't think the lack of rival is actually the issue. So a lucky issue for Prime Minister Abe is there's no national election until the end of next year. So, but then unless he can recover his popularity before, say, mid-2018, I think the ruling party will find, suitable alternatives.
We know that Shinzo Abe is looking at a major cabinet reshuffle. Can he regain any ground with that?
Right. I don't think so. So we still don't know the details or all the names of our next cabinet. But then, as I see it, I don't think Prime Minister Abe actually get the feeling of the voters that the voters is demanding him to do a complete reshuffle. But then Prime Minister Abe hasn't really realized the depth of his trouble.
Do you agree with that, Ra? I mean, it's got to a point where it might not make a difference, and he doesn't realise how badly damaged he is at this point.
Well, I think there may be some overconfidence in that area, but I think still we shouldn't underestimate Prime Minister Abe. Don't forget that he is somebody who, despite being opposed by various factions, has successfully charted one of the longest stints as Prime Minister of Japan in post-Cold War history, and is looking down the barrel at potentially being able to lay the ground for an unprecedented third term in office. So using this reshuffle, which is going to take place in 2 days' time, to perhaps galvanise his own closest supporters and possibly push to the fringes some of those that might more prominently oppose him, is something which he will definitely be looking to do, and perhaps we shouldn't judge too soon as to the efficacy of that reshuffle.
What will people be looking for in that reshuffle? I mean, should he fire his defence minister, for example?
Well, I mean, his defence minister, Inada, has already resigned, so this means that the position is effectively opened up. And I think it's unlikely that he would leave the current foreign minister, who is Fumio Kishida, in that role. He's there as interim, but this is a man who is also a powerful figure within the LDP and potentially could oppose Abe. So I think we might see him replace that role in the defence minister role with somebody who is up and coming, somebody that could perhaps work closely with him, as he himself thought would be the case with Inada Tomomi, and she unfortunately became embroiled in this scandal. So I think we might see one or two fresh faces, and we may see some of those who are most likely to oppose him being pushed somewhat to the fringes.
Takuji, just explain for us, why are some of these other policies of Abe's so unpopular? For example, shifting the country's defence policy and allowing Japanese troops to fight overseas for the first time since World War II. Why has that been seen so negatively in Japan?
Right. Well, I think Japanese public in general feel they are still not ready. They haven't actually done a proper, recounting of what went wrong before World War II. And then, Prime Minister Abe, and, he's more of a nationalist, I would say, revisionist group, where they secretly feel that Japan actually did nothing wrong in World War II. So I think Japanese public actually feel that kind of insincerity. So I think without, more deeper reconciliation of how Japan wants to position in the current modern world, I think Japanese public would feel very skeptical of being able to send army overseas, fight with US. I don't think Japanese public is ready for that.
Okay, very, very quickly, if Abe goes, does Abenomics go too?
I think there's a good chance. I think there's a strong lobby among Japanese banking against Abenomics. So there's a good chance that his policy could be derailed.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to have you with us, Takuji Okubo and Ra Mason.
One country in the Gulf region is a threat to global security: Qatar.
The Saudis, the UAE, Israel correctly saying Qatar has been funding terrorist organizations.
The diplomatic dispute between Qatar and its neighbours in the Gulf is now playing out on American television. A Saudi Arabian lobby in the US launched an ad campaign, once again accusing Doha of supporting terrorism. The 30-second ads cost $138,000 and were paid for by the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Now it seems like Doha is responding after it hired a Washington-based lobbying firm of its own, which was founded by former campaign aides to Donald Trump. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director for the Center on Peace and Liberties, joining us from Washington, D.C. Good to have you with us, Ivan. I mean, that advert is pretty hard-hitting that the Saudis have paid for. Who's it aimed at?
Well, it's aimed at not just the general public in America, because there was only a few spots purchased. It was aimed at the politicians, the opinion makers in the bureaucracy, because they were centered on ads in the national capital area, Washington, D.C. And these one-sided ads are, of course, not telling the whole story.
But if it's aimed at policymakers, is that because Saudi feels that it's failed to persuade Washington to fully back the blockade against Qatar?
Well, I think they're trying to influence it to their side. I think they have failed to do that simply because the United States has a major military base in Qatar. And when the ad says Qatar is destabilizing American allies, well, Qatar's an American ally. And there's U.S. allies on both sides of this dispute, and I think the State Department and Pentagon bureaucracy would like to take a more even-handed approach to the whole matter of the blockade. But of course, the president is sort of a free spirit, and he has sided with the Saudis in tweets and that sort of thing. So the U.S. policy is muddled, and I think that's why they're advertising. But I don't see the advertising doing much good. They haven't bought that many spots. And of course, advertising experts say the key to advertising is repetition. Most commercials you see on U.S. TV repeat themselves ad nauseum. These don't.
Yeah, I love your description of President Trump as being a free spirit. You're quite right. The messages coming out of the US on this have been totally confusing. We've had the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson saying he thinks the blockade should be lifted, and a US State Department praising Qatar as being a strong partner in the fight against terrorism. And yet none of this seems to have held any sway with the Saudis and the rest of the partners in the blockade, who are categorically saying that they will not have dialogue with Qatar unless the full list of 13 demands are met.
Yes, well, I think, you see sort of a taking of sides of various countries. You have the four countries of the Gulf led by Saudi Arabia imposing the sanctions. Then you have Qatar, and then you have Iran, and Qatar has a better relationship with Iran than those four countries. And then you see Israel in the background sort of taking the position of, not as vocal on the part of the Saudi government. And then, Turkey also has a military presence in there, as well as the United States does in Qatar. So I think those two countries are more even-handed in their approach, at least the State Department and Pentagon bureaucracies in the United States. We've already talked about the fight amongst the U.S. policy and muddled policy that we have, because the president, who I euphemistically call a free spirit, he's been called other things, but certainly the U.S. policy is not clear, and the U.S. could perform a valuable role in mediating among its allies, and it has done that to a certain extent with Rex Tillerson. But it would be much more effective if the U.S. government was united in saying, hey, we need to pull this blockade, this embargo, and get back to normal relations.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia and its allies have misjudged this blockade, and it has backfired somewhat because it's pushed Qatar even closer to Turkey and to some extent Iran as well, hasn't it?
Yes, I think so. And it also makes the government more resolute to, from its own population, to fight back against these people who are trying to cut off trade. The economic sanctions often have an economic effect for a while, and then it dissipates as ways are found around them. But it almost never has a political effect unless the objective is very modest. And this is not a modest. This list of demands that they had is certainly not modest. So I think my bet when this embargo was first put on, having no, track record yet, I said that it was probably going to fail, and I think it is failing. And certainly Qatar has made some changes, but I'm not sure that really changes much at all. I think these countries are going to have a face-saving way eventually to back off from this.
Yeah, and I think you do get the feeling that these four countries are surprised by how long Qatar has held out against this blockade. Perhaps they were expecting Qatar to cave a lot earlier, but as you say, it has been resolute. And we've also seen Qatar signing this deal with the US to do more about preventing the financing of terror organizations. Why is that not enough as a show of willingness to tackle some of the complaints that other Gulf states have about Qatar?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia really wants to have a unified front against its arch rival Iran, and Qatar runs its own independent foreign policy, and that's challenging to the leader of the Gulf states, which is Saudi Arabia, and so the Saudis want to maintain their dominance, and the new regime in Saudi Arabia, they're running a more aggressive foreign policy than the Saudis have ever run. They're in Yemen, they're fighting in Yemen, and they've got a blockade going there, which is causing a lot of pain to Yemen, because Yemen is a very poor country, and they're cutting off medicine and food. Qatar is, you know, if you want to mess with somebody, Qatar is probably not the best one to do. Qatar is far wealthier than Yemen, and it has a lot more staying power. And it also has other countries helping it, like Turkey and Iran and, you know, other countries. And even the United States is trying to mediate as best it can here. So I think, you know, Qatar is not without friends.
And what about some would say the irony of Saudi Arabia leading the charge against Qatar, accusing it of supporting terrorism, because there have been numerous studies showing, or research showing, that a lot of financing and supporting of Islamic extremism originates from Saudi Arabia. There was a recent British think tank saying the top foreign funder of Islamist extremism in the UK is Saudi Arabia. Is Saudi prepared for that kind of scrutiny, or should there be that kind of scrutiny?
Well, I think they should have been scrutinized a lot since 9/11. Most of the hijackers were Saudi, as everyone knows, and they've been funding all these radical Sunni educational institutions around the world. So I think they're public enemy number one for supporting terrorism. And the United States has never criticized Saudi because of the oil. They've ever since the 1930s, the United States made a deal with the leadership of Saudi Arabia. They would sell us their oil and keep a handle on the oil market for us, since they're a big producer, and we would provide their security. And that informal agreement is still in force. And but it's illogical for the United States to continue that, since the Saudis are the number one enemy as far as supporting terrorism.
Okay, so as far as resolutions go, if there is to be dialogue, who can persuade the parties to sit down and have dialogue? Should that push be coming from the US, from other Muslim countries, from Turkey?
Well, I think it's, you know, in any dispute, it's the obligation of the countries involved to solve it. But of course, if Turkey and the United States can perform some sort of mediation, and Turkey is, I would say, a good bet also, since it has, it's a Sunni country, and yet it's has a better relationship with Qatar than the Saudi Arabian and the rest of the group that's sanctioning. So I think, you know, Turkey can play a role. The United States can play a role if it gets its act together. And, you know, I think this is going to be peacefully resolved. And I think there's probably going to be a face-saving way for Saudi Arabia and the rest of them to back off from this. But I think these ads that we've been talking about on TV is sort of a measure of their desperation. You know, the Saudis used to only lobby behind the scenes. They were very, you know, you could never see their fingerprints on anything hardly. You knew they had been there, but they were very stealthy. But these are blatant ads, and so I think that's one mark of that they're getting a little nervous that this isn't going to work.
Yeah, and you've got Qatar taking out ads as well, so it's becoming a public relations battle as well as a diplomatic battle. If it's not resolved quickly, and I think everyone's been surprised by how long this has been dragging on, if it's not resolved quickly, where does this lead, Ivan? I mean, could we see the breakup of the GCC?
Well, you certainly could if it's not resolved. It's, you know, anytime an organization, one side of the organization is imposing not only sanctions, but a blockade, a land blockade on the other member of the organization, you have a real problem. And I think hopefully it will be solved so that we can get back to normal. And certainly it's destabilizing the region, and it's not really doing much good. And I think, you know, Qatar is a small country, but it's very resolute in its desire to keep an independent foreign policy, and it really doesn't look like it's going to knuckle under. So I think, you know, they will find a face-saving way to take off the blockade and the sanctions, and I don't think it's going to succeed. I think Qatar will end up winning this in the end.
Great to get your thoughts there, Ivan. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington, D.C., Ivan Eland.
Feels like there's a little bit of media bias, and so what we hope we can do is de-escalate that and turn that around. Say, hey, I don't like these leaks, and so we're going to stop the leaks, and if we don't stop the leaks, I'm going to stop you.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Shuli Ghosh. Next time we speak with Libya's foreign minister in his first interview since the ceasefire deal was struck in the country. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.